What if I told you this entire story started with a name that wasn't there? Not a scandalous confession, not a leaked audio tape, not a paparazzi photo snapped through a hedge in Montecito. Just a name, or more accurately, two names missing from a list. And that single absence has now spiraled into one of the most uncomfortable questions surrounding celebrity narratives, privacy, and credibility that we've seen in years. Because here's the thing. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In a world where everything can be spun, clarified, reframed, or blamed on misinformation, paperwork doesn't argue back. It just exists. Or it doesn't. And when a prestigious Montecito preschool was allegedly asked a routine question, a question parents ask all the time, the answer reportedly sent shockwaves through private circles long before it ever reached the public. No record, no listing, no immunization documentation on file. And suddenly, a simple verification turned into something much bigger. Now let's slow this down. Because this story is not about attacking children. It's not about invading privacy for the sake of cruelty. And it's not about pretending anyone outside a family knows their private lives better than they do. This story is about contradictions. About what happens when public narratives collide with institutional procedures. About how silence can sometimes speak louder than outrage. And about why this issue refuses to go away, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people feel. Ask yourself something honestly before we go any further. If a rumor was completely false, if it had no basis at all, would it still be spreading months later? Or would it have been shut down instantly? That question alone is why this matters. Because the claim isn't loud. It isn't flashy. It isn't dramatic on its face. It's quiet. Administrative. Almost boring. And that's exactly what makes it dangerous. According to multiple reports and circulating accounts, a Montecito area preschool, the kind that prides itself on discretion, privacy, and high-profile families, was contacted to confirm enrollment details. This is not unusual. Schools verify enrollment all the time. For transfers, for district records, for administrative reasons that never make headlines. But this time, the response allegedly wasn't, "We don't comment." It wasn't, "We can't confirm or deny." It wasn't even, "Records are private." It was something far simpler. No names found on the student list. Let that sit for a moment. Because in celebrity culture, absence is usually explained away quickly. Private enrollment, homeschooling, alternative education, temporary placement, all reasonable possibilities. And yet, that explanation didn't end the story. In fact, it ignited it. Because what followed wasn't a single denial that closed the door. It was silence, then frustration, then alleged anger behind the scenes. And most telling of all, no clean, definitive clarification that erased the doubt entirely. Now let's talk about why that matters. Public figures live in two realities at once. There's the story they tell the world, carefully curated, emotionally framed, deeply personal when it benefits them. And then there's the infrastructure that exists whether they like it or not. Doctors, schools, passports, visas, records. You can control interviews. You can choose what photos get released. You can even decide when to speak and when to stay silent. But you cannot rewrite a database with feelings. That's why this story doesn't fade. Because it isn't about what someone said on camera. It's about what allegedly wasn't on file. And when whispers began to circulate that the school also had no immunization records associated with the names, the situation shifted from curious to combustible. Why? Because immunization records are not casual documents. They are required. They are logged. They are tracked carefully, especially in California, and especially in private institutions that operate under strict regulatory frameworks. Schools can be flexible about many things. They are not flexible about compliance. Which leads to the next uncomfortable question. If there was a simple explanation, why hasn't it been presented clearly? No timeline, no clarification, no calm statement laying out exactly what happened and why the confusion exists. Instead, what allegedly followed was anger. Not confusion, not surprise. Anger. Reports describe frustration that this question was even asked, that institutions would dare to respond plainly instead of shielding the narrative, that routine procedures suddenly became public curiosity. But anger doesn't erase paperwork, and that's where this story changes tone, because the more defensive reactions become, whether real or perceived, the more people ask questions they weren't asking before. Questions like, why is enrollment being discussed at all? Why do stories keep shifting instead of settling? Why does every attempt to clarify seem to add another layer instead of removing one? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why does this story keep resurfacing? Let's be very clear here. No one outside of family knows everything. Speculation can run wild. And the internet has a terrible habit of filling gaps with its own imagination. But that's not what fuels stories like this. What fuels them is inconsistency. What fuels them is when explanations feel partial instead of complete, defensive instead of clarifying, emotional instead of factual. And once the idea took hold that the children's names were not present where they were widely believed to be, the conversation expanded. People began revisiting old interviews, old timelines, old claims about routines, schooling, and daily life. Not because they wanted a scandal, but because humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and patterns either align or they don't. Now here's where things get even more uncomfortable. The silence. Because in the age of instant responses, silence is rarely accidental. A single sentence could have ended this. Here is what happened. Here is the explanation. Here is why the records appeared that way. Instead, what we got was nothing. No detailed walkthrough. No administrative clarification. No calm breakdown that left no room for doubt. And in that vacuum, speculation thrives. You don't have to believe the most extreme theories to recognize something feels unresolved. Even supporters quietly admit that the lack of clarity is strange. Even critics admit they don't know the full truth. Which leaves us in the most uncomfortable place of all. The middle. The place where no one has enough information, but everyone senses something doesn't line up. And that's exactly where this story lives. Not in accusation, not in proof, but in the gap between what was expected and what was reportedly found. So before we go any further, ask yourself one more question. If this was a simple misunderstanding, why does it feel like it was treated as a threat? Because what came next wasn't just whispered frustration. It was a shift in tone. A sense that this wasn't supposed to be discussed at all. And that reaction, more than any document or denial, is what pulled this story out of private conversations and into public view. Because sometimes, the biggest red flag isn't what's missing. It's how people react when you notice it. And as we move forward, we're going to unpack this carefully. Not with assumptions, not with declarations, but with timelines, procedures, contradictions, and questions that still don't have answers. Because the deeper you look, the more one unsettling thought keeps resurfacing. What if the issue isn't that records were missing, but that they were never supposed to be looked at in the first place? And that brings us to where this story truly begins, with the system itself. Because before we can understand why those names allegedly weren't found, we have to understand how elite Montecito preschools actually work. And once you see that, everything changes. So here's the question no one ever asks out loud. What if the issue isn't who is missing, but how impossible it is for someone to simply vanish from the system if they were ever there at all? Because before we talk about names, reactions, or alleged outrage, we have to talk about the machinery behind elite preschools. Not the charming buildings, not the smiling websites, not the carefully worded mission statements about nurturing creativity and emotional intelligence. The machinery. The part that doesn't care who you are, how famous you are, or how carefully you've curated your public image. Because prestige preschools don't run on vibes. They run on compliance. And this is where many people misunderstand what private actually means. Private does not mean casual. Private does not mean optional. Private does not mean flexible when it comes to records. In fact, the more exclusive the institution, the tighter the documentation tends to be. Why? Because elite preschools don't just protect children. They protect themselves. Every enrollment begins the same way. Not with a photo op, not with a handshake, but with paperwork. Thick paperwork. Applications. Emergency contacts. Medical forms. Immunization documentation or legally recognized exemptions. Consent agreements, payment records. And here's something many people don't realize. Even wait lists generate records. Names get logged, dates get stamped, emails get archived. Because when families are wealthy, powerful, or high profile, schools are even more meticulous, not less. Mistakes become liabilities. So let's dismantle one comforting myth right now. The idea that a child could casually attend a prestigious preschool without leaving a trace is not how this world works. Not in Montecito. Not in California. Not anywhere that operates under licensing regulations. Now you might be thinking, sure, but what about privacy? Great question. Privacy is not invisibility. Privacy means schools don't publicly discuss enrollment. It does not mean records don't exist. And that distinction is crucial. Because when a school says, we cannot comment, that's privacy. When a school allegedly says, we have no record, that's something else entirely. And that difference is the crack this entire story falls through. Let's walk through a typical scenario. A child enrolls, even temporarily, even for a trial period. Their name enters the system. They are assigned an internal identifier. Their parent signs documents. Their health records are logged or flagged as pending. Even if the child never attends a full day, even if plans change, even if the family pulls out suddenly, the entry remains. Why? Because deleting records creates risk. Institutions don't erase paper trails, they archive them. So when reports began circulating that a school's response wasn't "we can't confirm," but "no names found," professionals quietly raised their eyebrows. Not because it proved anything, but because it contradicted how these systems are designed. And contradictions are where stories begin to rot or reveal. Now let's talk about immunization records, because this is where things get uncomfortable fast. In California, preschools are bound by strict health regulations. There are only a few options. You provide immunization documentation. You provide a legally valid exemption, or your enrollment remains incomplete. There is no secret fourth option, and schools don't improvise here. They don't say, we'll figure it out later. They don't shrug and hope no one checks. Why? Because inspections happen, audits happen, liability exists. Which means one of three things is true in any enrollment scenario. The records are on file. The records are pending and flagged. Or the child was never fully enrolled. There is no ghost student category. That's not how compliance works. And this is why the alleged mention of no immunization records struck such a nerve. Because that phrase doesn't suggest scandal. It suggests non-existence within the system. Now pause here and think. If the children were never enrolled at that specific preschool, that alone is not controversial. Families change plans all the time. They choose different schools. They homeschool. They delay enrollment. That's normal. What isn't normal is the reaction. Because if the explanation were simply, they never attended, this story would have ended immediately. A single calm clarification. Instead, what followed, according to multiple accounts, was tension. Not confusion. Not casual correction. Tension. And that's where people started asking the wrong questions for the wrong reasons. Not where are the kids? But why does this feel like something that wasn't supposed to surface? Now let's talk about how schools communicate. Institutional language is boring by design. It strips emotion out of everything. When schools respond to inquiries, they use standardized phrasing. They don't editorialize. They don't add drama. They don't express opinions. Which is why the reported wording matters so much. No record found is not a casual phrase. It's a database response. It's what you get when a query returns nothing. And that's why professionals who understand these systems reacted differently than the general public. Because they know what has to happen for a name to appear. And they know how hard it is for a name to disappear. Now let's address the counterarguments. Because there are many, and some are reasonable. What if the children were enrolled under a different name? Possible. But aliases don't bypass medical records. They don't bypass billing systems. They don't bypass guardian documentation. What if the enrollment was handled privately through a special arrangement? Special arrangements still generate paperwork. In fact, they generate more. What if the children never attended, and the public narrative simply assumed they did? That's plausible. But again, the reaction becomes the mystery. Why not say exactly that? Why not clarify with precision instead of letting speculation metastasize? This is where the story shifts from administrative curiosity to narrative tension. Because the silence wasn't neutral. It was loud. And in that silence, people began connecting dots that may or may not belong together. Old interviews resurfaced. References to routines were re-examined. Timelines were scrutinized. Not because people wanted to be cruel, but because when official explanations are absent, the human brain fills gaps aggressively. Now here's the part few people say openly. Elite institutions are trained to protect families, especially famous ones. Which means if a school gives a neutral response that inadvertently sparks controversy, the instinct is usually to shut it down fast. Clarify, reframe, close the loop. The fact that didn't happen is what made this linger. And linger. And linger. Now imagine being inside that system. Imagine being a staff member whose job is not to speculate, but to answer truthfully within policy. You don't write headlines. You don't manage PR. You respond to what the system shows. And if the system shows nothing, you can't invent something to smooth over optics. That's where institutional integrity collides with celebrity expectation. And when those two clash, things get messy. Because one side operates on emotion, narrative, and perception. The other operates on forms, timestamps, and checkboxes. And forms don't bend. They don't care who you are. They don't care how angry you get. They don't care how unfair something feels. They either populate or they don't. Which brings us back to the original discomfort. Not about children, not about parenting, but about control. Because in a world where image management is meticulous, this was one area where control may not have existed at all. And when that reality surfaced, even quietly, it reportedly triggered alarm. Not because of what it proved, but because of what it couldn't be spun into something else. Now ask yourself this. If the issue was purely a misunderstanding, why does the explanation still feel incomplete? Why does every attempt to dismiss it rely on emotion instead of procedure? Why hasn't anyone simply walked the public through the administrative reality step by step? Because doing so would either end the story instantly or open a door no one wants opened. And that's where we are now, standing at the edge of a system that doesn't lie, but doesn't explain itself either. And as we move forward, the question stops being about one preschool. It becomes about how many assumptions people have been making without verification. Because once you understand how these institutions work, you start noticing inconsistencies elsewhere. And that's exactly what happened next. Because after people understood the system, they went back to the moment that triggered the inquiry in the first place. The call, the question, and the answer no one expected. So let's go back to the moment everything shifted. Not the headlines, not the outrage, not the theories. The question. Because stories like this don't usually explode because of what's said. They explode because of who says it, when they say it, and how routine the moment feels right up until it doesn't. Here's the mini hook you need to sit with. What if the most disruptive question in this entire saga wasn't asked by a journalist, a critic, or a troll, but by someone doing something completely normal? Someone making a call that happens thousands of times every week across California. Someone who didn't expect anything unusual at all. Because according to multiple accounts, this wasn't a fishing expedition. It wasn't a gotcha. It was administrative. And that's what makes it dangerous. Imagine a quiet weekday morning. No cameras. No reporters waiting outside a gate. No dramatic confrontation. Just a phone call. The kind of call where the person on the other end expects one of three responses. Yes, they're enrolled. We can't confirm enrollment. Or, you'll need written authorization. That's it. That's how these things usually go. But instead, what allegedly came back was something else. Something unexpected enough to stop the conversation cold. No record found. Now pause. Because before people started speculating wildly, the first reactions weren't public at all. They were internal. Raised eyebrows. Double checks. Quiet confirmations. Because when an answer doesn't match expectations, professionals don't immediately assume scandal. They assume error. So the natural next step would be verification. Was the name spelled correctly? Was the search done under the right category? Was the time frame accurate? That's standard procedure. And here's where the story deepens. According to reports, the response didn't change. Not after rephrasing. Not after clarification. Not after follow-up. Which is why this moment matters. Because a single mistake is noise. A repeated result is signal. Now let's talk about who would ask this kind of question. Not gossip bloggers. Not anonymous tipsters. But someone with a reason. Transfers. District coordination. Administrative verification. These inquiries happen quietly and constantly. They are not designed to provoke. They are designed to confirm. Which raises the next uncomfortable question. If this was such a routine inquiry, why did it reportedly trigger such a strong reaction afterward? Because here's what allegedly happened next. The call didn't end the story. It started it. Once the response came back, it didn't stay with the person. but because the answer didn't line up with what people believed to be true. And when that happens inside professional environments, people compare notes. Not maliciously, instinctively. Did you get the same response? Am I missing something? Can you check on your end? That's how internal confusion grows. And confusion is where narratives begin to fracture. Now imagine being on the receiving end of this realization. Imagine believing something firmly, believing it has been settled, believing it is not up for discussion, and then discovering that, within an institutional system, that belief has no footprint, no entry, no flag, no pending file, just nothing. Even if there is a perfectly innocent explanation, that moment is destabilizing, because it suggests a disconnect between what is assumed and what is documented. And documentation is stubborn. It doesn't bend to expectation. It doesn't correct itself out of politeness. So when this information allegedly moved upward, the tone reportedly changed. This is where accounts begin describing frustration. Not curiosity, not surprise. Frustration. And frustration tells us something important. Because people get frustrated when something challenges control, not when something is simply misunderstood. Now let's be careful here. No one outside those conversations knows exactly what was said, how it was said, or by whom. But patterns matter. And the pattern described by multiple sources follows a familiar arc. First, disbelief. Then irritation. Then an attempt to shut the door. Why? Because from a narrative standpoint, this wasn't supposed to be a story. It was supposed to be invisible. And invisible things don't require explanations. But once the answer existed, invisibility was no longer an option. Now ask yourself something. If the response had been, "We can't confirm," would any of this exist? No. That phrasing would have closed the loop instantly. Privacy respected. No contradiction created. Which brings us back to the wording. Because institutions choose their words carefully. And when they say no record, they are not making a claim about truth. They are reporting what the system shows. That's it. No judgment. No implication. Just output. And that's why this allegedly escalated so quickly behind the scenes. Because output is hard to argue with. You can reinterpret a statement. You can contextualize a comment. But you cannot emotionally negotiate with a database. Now let's talk about the next step that often happens in situations like this. Damage control. Not in the dramatic sense. In the quiet, professional sense. Calls. Emails. Clarifications. Institutions talking to institutions. And according to accounts, that's exactly what happened. Except the clarification never fully landed. No updated statement replaced the original response. No administrative explanation surfaced to reconcile the discrepancy, which is unusual, because when institutions miscommunicate, they correct themselves quickly. They issue follow-ups. They clean up language. They don't let confusion fester, unless there is nothing to correct. That possibility is what makes this so uncomfortable, because it means the original answer may have been accurate within its narrow scope. And accuracy doesn't care about optics. Now consider the emotional layer. When people feel blindsided, they often react emotionally. They interpret routine actions as attacks. They perceive neutral procedures as hostile. And that's reportedly what happened next. The inquiry itself became the problem, not the answer. Why was this asked? Who authorized this? Why is this being looked into at all? Those questions signal something important. They signal that the expectation was silence, not transparency, which leads us to the most revealing part of this chapter. The shift from clarification to containment. Because instead of addressing the discrepancy openly, the energy reportedly went towards stopping the conversation entirely. And that's where stories escape private boundaries. Because when you try to contain something without explaining it, people talk, not to create drama, to make sense of what they don't understand. And that's how this moved from a routine inquiry to whispered concern. From whispered concern to quiet discussion. From quiet discussion to speculation. Now here's the contradiction that keeps resurfacing. On one hand, the narrative emphasizes privacy and protection. On the other hand, the reaction suggests fear of exposure. Those two don't always align. True privacy is calm. It doesn't panic when someone checks a record. It doesn't escalate when a question is asked. It simply says, "This is private," and moves on. What's described here feels different. It feels like something touched a nerve. Not because it was intrusive, but because it wasn't supposed to surface at all. And this is where the story starts to shift focus. away from the children, away from schooling, toward narrative management. Because once the inquiry existed, it couldn't be erased. It could only be explained or ignored. And ignoring it turned out to be the worst possible option. Because silence invites interpretation, and interpretation invites amplification. Which brings us to the moment when this crossed a line. When what was once internal began leaking outward, not in documents, in conversations, private remarks, carefully worded statements, hints dropped without full context, enough to suggest something was wrong, not enough to explain what. And that imbalance is gasoline. Now think about this. If you were confident that everything aligned, would you allow ambiguity to grow? Or would you extinguish it immediately? That's the question many observers began asking. Not because they wanted a scandal, but because the response pattern didn't match the confidence projected publicly. And once people noticed that mismatch, they started revisiting other moments with fresh eyes. Moments that had been accepted without scrutiny. Statements that suddenly felt less solid than they once did. Not because they were proven false, but because trust had been shaken. And trust, once cracked, never breaks cleanly. It fractures, which leads us to what happened next. Because after the inquiry, after the reaction, after the silence, people stopped focusing on the school. They started focusing on the story that had been told all along. And that's where the real tension begins. Because once you question one assumption, you begin questioning others. And that's exactly where this is heading. Because the next chapter isn't about institutions. It's about expectation, about what people thought they knew, and about why certain details now feel less certain than they once did. And when those assumptions started to unravel, everything changed. So here's the question that changed the temperature of the room. If names weren't on the list, what does that actually mean? Not emotionally, not symbolically, administratively. Because before this story spiraled into theories and outrage, it hit a very basic fork in the road. Either the absence was normal, or it wasn't. And the unsettling part is how hard it became to land firmly on either side. Let's start with the most comforting explanation. Coincidence. Maybe the children were never enrolled at that particular preschool. Maybe plans changed. Maybe assumptions were made by outsiders based on geography, lifestyle, or casual remarks. That happens all the time. People hear Montecito. They hear preschool. They connect dots that were never meant to be connected. If that's all this was, the solution is simple. A brief clarification. A calm correction. End of story. But that didn't happen. And that's where coincidence begins to feel thin. Because coincidence doesn't usually provoke defensive reactions. It doesn't generate whispered frustration. It doesn't inspire sudden silence. Coincidence shrugs and moves on. What happened here didn't shrug. So let's move to the next possibility. Policy. Elite preschools operate under strict confidentiality rules. They are trained not to confirm or deny enrollment publicly. So when people first heard "no names found," some assumed it was just policy language. A softer way of saying, "we can't comment." But that explanation collapses quickly once you understand how institutional language works. Policies don't masquerade as database responses. They have scripts. They say things like, "We do not comment on student enrollment. We cannot confirm or deny attendance. All records are confidential." Those phrases are designed to close conversations safely. No record found does the opposite. It opens questions, because it implies a search was conducted, and results were returned. That's not a policy response. That's a system response. And systems don't editorialize. They don't protect narratives. They don't soften language to spare feelings. They output what they see. Which brings us to the third possibility. Something else. This is where things get uncomfortable. Because something else doesn't automatically mean wrongdoing. It can mean misalignment. Between what people believe and what is documented. Between what was implied and what was formalized. Between narrative and process. And once you accept that possibility, the story shifts. Because then the question isn't, why aren't the names there? It's, why did so many people assume they were? That assumption didn't come from nowhere. It came from context. Public remarks about routines. References to normalcy. Casual language that suggested everyday family life. None of that is illegal. None of that is proof of anything. But when documentation fails to reflect implied reality, tension emerges. And that tension doesn't disappear on its own. It seeks resolution. Now here's where the contradictions begin stacking. On one hand, there's a strong emphasis on privacy, a repeated insistence that children should be left out of public scrutiny. On the other hand, the public narrative has often leaned on relatability, school runs, playdates, normalcy. Those two impulses pull in opposite directions, and when they collide, something has to give. Either the narrative becomes more private, or the documentation becomes more visible. But here's what didn't happen. The narrative didn't retract, and the documentation didn't surface. Instead, we got ambiguity. And ambiguity is dangerous, because ambiguity invites interpretation. And interpretation, once unleashed, is impossible to control. Now let's talk about lists. Because lists feel neutral. They feel objective. They don't care about status. They don't flatter anyone. You're either on them, or you're not. And when people hear student list, they imagine something simple. A roster, a spreadsheet, names in rows. But in reality, lists are layered. There are active lists, pending lists, wait lists, historical records. Even children who never attend a full day often appear somewhere, which is why professionals found the alleged absence puzzling. Not alarming, puzzling. Because puzzlement suggests curiosity, not accusation. It suggests something doesn't align with expectation. And when expectation fails repeatedly, people start asking different questions. Not is this bad, but what are we misunderstanding? That's where this story should have stopped. At misunderstanding. But it didn't. Because misunderstanding usually dissolves with explanation. This didn't. Now consider how stories behave in the real world. They don't explode all at once. They simmer. This one simmered quietly. In professional circles. In private conversations. In side comments that ended with, "That's strange." Strange is the most dangerous word in any system. Because strange doesn't accuse. It invites investigation. And once investigation begins, it rarely stays contained. People began asking broader questions. If enrollment wasn't confirmed here, where was it? If not this preschool, another one? If another one, why the confusion? And why had no one clarified it publicly when assumptions were clearly spreading? Silence became the loudest detail. Now here's the twist many didn't expect. Some defenders argued that the absence proved nothing at all, that people were obsessing over paperwork instead of respecting privacy, that this was an overreach. And that argument resonated with many. Because yes, paperwork alone doesn't tell a full story. But here's the contradiction. If paperwork doesn't matter, why did its absence cause such reported agitation? Why did a routine inquiry escalate emotionally? Why did the response feel disproportionate to the supposed insignificance of the issue? That's where logic begins to wobble. Because reactions tell stories too. And reactions don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in response to perceived threat. Now let's talk about threat. What threat exists in a name not appearing on a list? Only one. Narrative disruption. The possibility that something assumed might not be formally true. And in a media environment where every inconsistency is magnified, even small gaps become liabilities. Which explains the tension. Not panic. Not fear. Tension. The kind that emerges when control slips momentarily. Now step back and look at the pattern forming. A routine inquiry. An unexpected response. A strong reaction. Silence instead of clarification. That pattern doesn't scream scandal. It whispers discomfort. And discomfort is often more revealing than outrage. Because outrage can be performative. Discomfort is instinctive. Now let's consider one more angle people rarely discuss. Timing. Why did this surface when it did? Why not earlier? Why not later? Stories often emerge when conditions align. When curiosity meets access. When assumptions meet verification. This wasn't someone digging for dirt. It was someone checking a box. And boxes don't care about celebrity. They only care about completion. Which brings us to the most unsettling realization of this chapter. This story may not exist because something is wrong. It may exist because something ordinary didn't happen where people assumed it did. And that gap, between assumption and reality, is where narratives unravel. Now think about how difficult it is to walk something back once it's been implied publicly. You can't say too much without inviting scrutiny. You can't say too little without fueling speculation. You're trapped. And when people feel trapped, they often choose silence. But silence isn't neutral. It tilts conversations in unpredictable directions, which is exactly what happened next. Because once the focus shifted from the school to the assumption itself, People began revisiting everything that assumption rested on. Casual remarks, timeline hints, stories told without details. And suddenly, things that once felt harmless felt less solid. Not false, just unverified. And in the age of verification, that matters. Because trust is no longer built on belief. It's built on receipts. And when receipts are missing, even the most sympathetic audiences begin asking questions. Quietly at first, then out loud. And those questions lead us directly into the next phase of this story. Because once people stopped arguing about the list, they started talking about what changed everything. The moment immunization records entered the conversation, that single detail turned curiosity into concern, and concern into confrontation. Because paperwork about health isn't optional, and it isn't vague. It's either there, or it isn't. And when that detail surfaced, the tone shifted permanently. Because that wasn't about assumption anymore. That was about compliance. And that's where this story truly detonates. Here's the question that made people stop arguing about assumptions and start worrying about facts. Why did a single administrative detail shift this story from curiosity to concern? Because the moment immunization records entered the conversation, everything changed. Not emotionally, structurally. Up until that point, people could argue about misunderstandings, about assumptions, about privacy. But immunization records don't live in the realm of interpretation. They live in the realm of requirement. And that's why this detail landed so hard. Let's slow this down, because the reaction to this part of the story reveals more than the detail itself. In California, preschools operate under specific health regulations. These rules don't bend based on fame. They don't soften based on influence. They don't disappear because someone is high profile. If a child is enrolled, one of a small number of things must be true. The immunization records are submitted and logged. A legally recognized exemption is submitted and logged. Or the enrollment remains incomplete and flagged. There is no other category. No, we'll circle back. No, this is private, so we don't need paperwork. No, trust us. The system does not run on trust. It runs on compliance, which means the phrase that allegedly surfaced, no immunization records on file, isn't casual language. It's a status. It tells you something specific about where that child exists in the system, or doesn't. Now, here's where people misunderstand what this does and does not mean. It does not mean anyone did something illegal. It does not mean a rule was broken. It does not mean wrongdoing occurred. What it does mean is that the system, as accessed at that moment, showed no completed record tied to those names. That's it. But that alone was enough to trigger alarm. Why? Because schools are inspected. They are audited. They are accountable. And health compliance is one of the first things regulators check, which means schools are careful, almost obsessively careful. They do not casually misreport this information. They do not guess. They do not speculate. They look at the file and report what it says. So when people heard this detail, the debate shifted instantly. This was no longer about whether a child attended a specific classroom. It was about whether formal enrollment ever occurred at all. Because without immunization documentation or exemption, enrollment doesn't progress beyond a certain point. And here's the uncomfortable part. If enrollment never progressed, then many assumptions collapse at once. Not because anyone lied, but because implication replaced confirmation. And implication doesn't hold up under administrative scrutiny. Now let's talk about reactions. Because reactions tell stories too. When this detail surfaced, the reported response wasn't calm clarification. It wasn't a procedural explanation. It wasn't a step-by-step breakdown of how records are handled. It was anger, strong emotion. And that reaction is telling. Because if the explanation were simple, the response would have been boring. Boring explanations and stories. Anger extends them. Ask yourself this. If someone claims something incorrect about you that could be disproven instantly, would you rage? Or would you correct? Anger suggests something else is happening. Not guilt. Pressure. Pressure to maintain a narrative. Pressure to prevent further digging. Pressure to keep something mundane from becoming symbolic. Because immunization records are not just paperwork. They are a symbol of participation in systems that don't bend. And when people realize that symbol is missing, they start asking dangerous questions. Questions like, was there an assumption that no one would ever check? Was there confidence that privacy would prevent verification? Was there a belief that narrowed? And once immunization records entered the picture, people began revisiting those cues with a sharper lens. Statements about routine, references to schedules, casual mentions of daily life. All of it suddenly felt less grounded. Not false, just unanchored. And when audiences feel unanchored, they search for solid ground. Paperwork is solid ground, which is why the lack of it becomes a problem. Now let's talk about why this detail refuses to fade. Because immunization records are universal. They apply to everyone, which means people can relate. They know how this works. They've filled out the forms. They've chased doctors' offices. They've submitted copies. So when someone hears no records, they don't think scandal. They think process. And that's why this story hit such a nerve. It wasn't sensational. It was familiar. And familiarity makes inconsistencies easier to spot. Now consider the timing of the reaction again. If this was truly irrelevant, why react at all? Why not let it pass quietly? Why not say nothing and allow the story to die? Because silence didn't kill it. It fed it. Because silence in response to procedural questions feels evasive. Not because it is, but because people are trained to expect clarity around process. Which leads us to the most revealing part of this chapter. The emotional escalation. Reports describe anger, not concern. Frustration, not confusion. That suggests the issue wasn't the detail itself. It was the implication. The implication that something assumed might not be formally documented. And documentation is where narratives lose flexibility. Because once something is documented, it's fixed. And once something is missing from documentation, it can't be retroactively inserted without scrutiny, which creates pressure. Pressure to prevent further inquiry. Pressure to stop people from asking the wrong questions. Pressure to keep administrative realities from becoming public narratives. And that pressure is what people sensed, even without proof, even without documents. They sensed it in the tone, in the response, in the silence. And sensing pressure is often enough to keep a story alive. Now ask yourself this. If you were confident that everything aligned, would this detail bother you? Or would you dismiss it calmly? The fact that it bothered people at all is what transformed this from a footnote into a focal point. Because once immunization records were mentioned, the conversation could no longer be framed as invasive curiosity. It became about compliance. And compliance is objective. You either meet the requirement, or you don't. And if you don't, the system reflects that. Without emotion, without judgment. Which brings us to the realization that changed the trajectory of this story. The issue wasn't what people believed. It was what the system could verify. And once people understood that distinction, they stopped debating motives. They started examining timelines. And timelines are unforgiving. Because timelines don't care about intention. They care about sequence. What happened first? What happened next? What documentation existed when? And once that lens was applied, other details started to wobble. Not collapse. Wobble. Small things. Comments that didn't align perfectly. Dates that felt approximate instead of precise. Nothing conclusive. But enough to create unease. And unease is contagious. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because once people fixated on the records, they started asking about reactions. Not public reactions. Private ones. What was said behind closed doors. How institutions responded. And whether damage control quietly replaced transparency. Because when systems and narratives collide, someone always tries to manage the fallout. And what allegedly happened next says more than any missing document ever could. Let's talk about what usually happens when systems and narratives collide. Because it's rarely loud at first. It's quiet, carefully worded, cautious, almost polite. And that's why the next phase of this story is so revealing. Here's the mini hook you need to sit with. If nothing was wrong, why did everything suddenly feel urgent? Because according to multiple accounts, once the immunization detail surfaced, the atmosphere reportedly shifted. Not publicly, privately, behind the scenes. This wasn't about headlines yet. This was about control. And control is always exercised first where no one is watching. Think about how institutions behave when there's a genuine misunderstanding. They clarify. They document. They align language. They don't escalate emotionally. They don't rush to shut conversations down. They don't treat routine verification as a threat. But that's not what was described here. What was described sounded more like containment, not explanation. Containment. Calls made quickly. Messages sent with urgency. a tone that suggested something had gone further than expected. And again, none of this proves wrongdoing, but it does reveal priorities. Because when the priority is truth, transparency follows. When the priority is optics, pressure follows. Now ask yourself this. Why would an administrative misunderstanding require emotional intervention at all? Why not let the system speak? Why not calmly say, here's what happened. Here's why this looks confusing. That explanation never arrived. And that absence became the story. According to accounts, once the issue was raised internally, the focus reportedly shifted away from correcting records and toward addressing the inquiry itself. Who asked? Why was it asked? Who authorized it? Those questions are telling, because they frame the inquiry as the problem, not the discrepancy. And when the question becomes the enemy, it usually means the answer is inconvenient. Now let's pause here and be fair. Imagine being a high-profile family accustomed to controlling your narrative. Imagine discovering that a routine administrative response has created uncertainty. That would be frustrating. Anyone would feel blindsided. But frustration alone doesn't explain escalation. Because frustration usually leads to clarification. Escalation leads to silence. And silence is exactly what followed. Not just publicly, institutionally. No follow-up statement. No procedural explanation. No administrative walkthrough to close the gap. Which is unusual. Because institutions are good at this. They deal with confusion constantly. They know how to fix it. Unless fixing it reveals something they'd rather not spotlight. Now consider the concept of damage control. Damage control doesn't always mean something bad happened. Sometimes it means something embarrassing happened. Sometimes it means an assumption was exposed. Sometimes it means a story people believed wasn't fully grounded. And embarrassment is powerful. It motivates faster than truth. Because truth can wait. Embarrassment feels urgent. And urgency was reportedly present here. Now let's talk about tone. Tone matters more than words. According to descriptions, the tone behind the scenes was not curious. It wasn't puzzled. It wasn't collaborative. It was irritated. And irritation often signals that someone feels challenged rather than confused. Which brings us to a key contradiction. On one hand, the issue was framed as trivial. On the other hand, it provoked significant emotional response. Those two don't coexist comfortably. If something truly doesn't matter, people don't react strongly to it. They ignore it. They laugh it off. They move on. Strong reactions signal perceived risk. Risk to reputation. Risk to credibility. Risk to control. Now think about why control matters so much in this context. Public narratives are carefully constructed. They rely on consistency, not necessarily on detail, but on tone. Once inconsistencies appear, even small ones, people begin listening differently. They stop hearing the emotion. They start listening for facts. And facts are less forgiving. Which explains why, according to accounts, the effort reportedly shifted toward minimizing discussion rather than clarifying it. Shutting down conversation feels safer than feeding it. Except it rarely works. Because shutting down conversation creates curiosity, and curiosity spreads. Now let's address another possibility. Miscommunication. This is the most generous interpretation. Perhaps the inquiry was misunderstood. Perhaps the response was misphrased. Perhaps context was lost. That happens. But miscommunication is easy to fix. You clarify. You reissue. You align. You don't let the misunderstanding linger. Unless the clarification would raise more questions than it answers. Which may explain why nothing replaced the original response. Because once something is officially corrected, it creates a paper trail. And paper trails attract attention. Which brings us to another uncomfortable reality. Once institutions communicate officially, they become accountable. Every word is recorded. Every clarification can be scrutinized later. Silence avoids that. Silence leaves room for interpretation. But interpretation is a double-edged sword. It can fade, or it can metastasize. In this case, it metastasized. Because people began comparing reactions. They noticed how quickly the tone hardened. They noticed how defensive the situation became. They noticed how the emphasis shifted from, "this isn't accurate," to "this shouldn't be discussed." Those are very different positions. And audiences are good at sensing that difference. Now let's talk about why this story moved beyond administrative circles. Because once internal containment fails, leaks begin. Not formal leaks. Informal ones. Comments shared in confidence. Observations pass quietly. Reactions described without details. Enough to suggest something was off, not enough to explain what. And that imbalance is powerful. It makes people lean in. Because humans hate unresolved tension. And unresolved tension is what this story became. Now consider how this would feel from the outside. You hear there was an inquiry. You hear the response didn't match expectations. You hear there was anger, but you don't hear an explanation. That doesn't make you assume guilt. It makes you assume complexity. And complexity is fertile ground for speculation. Which brings us to the next layer of contradiction. Public messaging emphasized calm and privacy. Private reactions reportedly conveyed urgency and irritation. Those two tones don't align. And when tone doesn't align, trust erodes. Not instantly. Gradually. People start rereading statements, rewatching interviews, listening differently, not because they want to disbelieve, but because something feels unresolved. Now here's the key insight of this chapter. The reaction became part of the story, not the records, not the school, the reaction, because reactions reveal priorities. And the priority here appeared to be containment over clarity. That choice shaped everything that followed. Because once clarity is delayed, it becomes harder to deliver later. The longer ambiguity exists, the more invested people become in interpreting it. And once interpretations spread, even truth struggles to reclaim ground. Which is why, instead of dying quietly, this story grew legs. It moved from administrative curiosity to public intrigue. From public intrigue to online debate. From online debate to polarized interpretation. And at every stage, the lack of a clean explanation loomed. Now let's consider one final contradiction before we move on. If the goal was to protect children from scrutiny, why allow ambiguity to flourish? Ambiguity draws attention. Clarity ends it. So why choose the path that extends discussion? Unless the clarity required would open doors better left closed. Not because something sinister happened, but because something assumed didn't. And assumptions, once exposed, are hard to walk back without embarrassment. Which brings us to the turning point. Because once people realized this wasn't going to be clarified quickly, they stopped waiting. They started looking, not for proof, for patterns. And patterns are where stories gain momentum. Because patterns don't need confirmation to feel real. They only need repetition. And once people began spotting repetition, the narrative shifted again, away from institutions, toward public storytelling itself. Because if the system didn't reflect the story, maybe the story itself needed to be re-examined. And that's where this truly leaves the administrative realm. Because the next chapter isn't about records. It's about public narratives. What was said, what was implied, and what people now hear differently because of everything that's happened so far. And once that lens is applied, some past moments take on a very different tone. Here's the question that quietly rearranged everything. What happens when a story you've heard 100 times suddenly sounds different? Not because new facts emerged, but because the old ones lost their footing. Because that's where we are now. This chapter isn't about schools. It isn't about immunization forms. It isn't even about reactions behind closed doors. It's about narrative. Public narrative versus private record. And once those two stop aligning, nothing ever feels the same again. Think about how narratives work. They're not built all at once. They're assembled piece by piece. A quote here, a casual remark there, a reassuring phrase dropped into an interview, a comment that sounds ordinary enough to pass without scrutiny. Over time, those pieces harden into assumed truth. Not because anyone set out to deceive, but because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates belief. Now imagine that belief resting on a foundation no one ever thought to check. That's the moment we're talking about. Because once the administrative questions surfaced, people didn't immediately accuse. They rewound. They replayed. They listened again. Not with hostility, with curiosity. And curiosity is far more dangerous to a narrative than anger. Because anger dismisses. Curiosity investigates. So let's talk about the narrative people believe they understood. The story of normalcy. The idea that life had settled into something quiet, routine, and ordinary. School days. Schedules. Daily rhythms. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sensational. Just normal life. That story was comforting. It reassured supporters. It disarmed critics. It closed doors before they could be opened. And it worked. until paperwork entered the conversation. Because paperwork doesn't tell stories. It doesn't soothe. It doesn't reassure. It either exists or it doesn't. And when people realized that the system couldn't confirm what the narrative implied, the tone shifted. Not outwardly. Internally, people started asking questions they hadn't asked before. Not because they wanted controversy, but because the contrast was too sharp to ignore. Public narrative said, everything is ordinary. Private records suggested, something may not be formally documented. That doesn't automatically mean deception, but it does mean misalignment. And misalignment creates friction. Now here's where this gets uncomfortable. Public narratives thrive on ambiguity. They rely on implication. Private records despise ambiguity. They demand precision. They require dates, signatures, forms. And when those two worlds collide, one of them always looks weak. It's never the records. Because records don't argue. They don't defend themselves. They just sit there. Which means the narrative has to do the work. And when a narrative suddenly has to work harder, people notice. That's what happened here. Statements that once felt reassuring began to feel vague. Descriptions that once felt detailed began to feel carefully nonspecific. Not wrong, just strategically open-ended. And once people noticed that, they couldn't unnotice it. Now let's be fair again. Public figures are not required to disclose everything. Privacy is legitimate. No one is owed access to personal lives. That's true. But here's the contradiction. You can't simultaneously lean on relatability and reject verification. You can't say, this is normal life, and then object when people expect normal documentation. Those two positions pull against each other. And when they pull hard enough, something snaps. Not publicly. Internally. Trust starts to thin. Not vanish. Thin. And thinning trust changes how everything is heard. Now think about how audiences behave when trust thins. They don't immediately revolt. They don't flip sides overnight. They become cautious. They start listening for what isn't said. They notice patterns instead of moments. And that's exactly what happened next. People began noticing how often stories relied on implication instead of confirmation. How frequently timelines were referenced without dates. How often phrases like, around that time, replace specifics. Again, none of this proves anything. But proof isn't what destabilizes narratives. Inconsistency does. Now let's talk about why private records are so powerful in this context. Because they exist independently of intention. A narrative can be sincere and still incomplete. A record doesn't care. It reflects process, not feeling. Which means when a record fails to support a narrative, the tension is unavoidable. You can reinterpret a story. You can contextualize a quote. You can reframe intention. You cannot reframe a missing entry. And that's why this chapter matters. Because once people understood that distinction, they stopped arguing about motive. They started asking about structure. What systems were involved? What processes would normally occur? What documentation would be standard? And once you ask those questions, you stop engaging emotionally. You start thinking procedurally. And procedural thinking is merciless. It strips away charisma. It ignores sympathy. It only asks, does this align? Now here's where things take a sharper turn. Some defenders argued that private records should never be weighed against public narratives. That doing so violates privacy. That argument sounds strong, but it collapses under its own weight. Because the issue wasn't that records were exposed. It was that their absence was referenced. No documents were leaked. No files were shown. No personal data was shared. Just a reported status. And that status conflicted with assumptions. Which means the privacy argument didn't actually address the discomfort. It redirected it. And redirection only works when people aren't already paying attention. By this point, they were. Now consider this. If the public narrative had avoided everyday details entirely, none of this would matter. No one would expect confirmation. But once everyday life became part of the story, everyday systems entered the conversation. And everyday systems run on documentation. Which leads us to another subtle but important shift. The narrative stopped being about individuals. It became about credibility. Not moral credibility. Structural credibility. The question shifted from do you believe them to does this align? And alignment is measurable. That's what makes it dangerous. Now let's talk about why this resonated so widely. Because people recognize the pattern. They've seen it before. Not with this family. With institutions. With corporations. with public figures who over-relied on narrative and underestimated verification. People remember those stories. They remember how small discrepancies turned into